Good morning. So first, let me say thank you for including me in the program. As you know, it's a beautiful country, and so having the opportunity to visit is a wonderful opportunity for me. And I enjoyed some incredibly gratifying tourism over the weekend, which I'd be more than willing to discuss with you later. Let me apologize in advance. I have a tendency to speak extremely quickly, and so if I start speaking too quickly, you can wave your hands or pound on the table or whatever you need to do, but just try to slow me down, because if you're not understanding me, there's not much point in me doing my talking here today. So, for me, public procurement is not only important, but is hugely interesting, fascinating, and frankly, entertaining. I've seen just about everything in the United States and in countries around the world, but I want to just emphasize a few things before I get to my formal presentation. As you know, procurement is difficult. This is hard work, and in my experience, in my country and in other countries, the public doesn't understand this, and the media doesn't understand it, and far too often the legislature doesn't understand it. So what often happens is procurement is a thankless task where the hard work is underappreciated and easily criticized. So maybe the most important message I want you to take away today from my presentation is that you are not alone in your struggles with procurement. Public procurement, and particularly procurement reform, is a constant topic of discussion around the world, and your procurement reforms, particularly as were just discussed, reflect many global best practices, so you're now increasingly part of the same global conversation that we're having every day. But now, let me be frank, or shall I say harsh, to the extent that you've gone through the preliminary steps of designing a good system, now the hard work really begins. One of the most disappointing things that we've learned around the world in the last 20 to 30 years is that designing a public procurement system is actually easier than we thought. And I'll talk more about this later, but now that many countries have designed different types of procurement systems, and we've agreed on some global best practices, we can often agree as to what good procurement systems do right and what bad procurement systems do poorly. But the real challenge, once you've designed a good system, is to actually implement the challenges or make it work. Another way to think about that is the hardest thing in public procurement is changing behavior. Procurement rules and regulations are words on paper. Procurement officials are people, and people like you and your spouse and your friends and your children are very hard to make do what we want them to do. So the real challenges in procurement are to try to convince everyone that the goals make sense and that it's worth doing what they've been asked to do, which is one of the reasons that I'm very excited to talk so much about policy and strategy later. There are two key ingredients, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow afternoon, that I encourage you to begin thinking about now and almost every day in procurement. I want you to think about evaluating the system, or as we might say, self-assessing, or looking at ourselves to see how we're doing. And then I also want you to think about continuous adjustment and improvement. As we say in procurement, the only constant is change. We will consistently be tweaking and improving and refining and trying to massage or manage our procurement system. In other words, for better or worse, procurement reform never ends. We'll be doing this for the rest of our lives. We'll be having the same conversation when all of us have gray hair or maybe no hair. We'll see. Okay. The most exciting part of the program for me today is talking about vision and strategy. And I say that's exciting, and I commend you for being part of the conversation, because most governments don't spend enough time or energy thinking about this. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I became an expert in United States public procurement without ever thinking about why we did what we did. I memorized the rules. I knew how the process worked, but I wasn't always thinking about what we were trying to achieve, and that's really what I want you to focus on today. I was very pleased to hear this morning discussion of transparency and efficiency, and these are themes that I'll come back to a little bit later. They're very important. So before I formally start, let me tell you where I'm going to conclude this morning. Procurement rules or regulations tell us how to buy, what to do, and what not to do. They tell us how to work through a process. Procurement training, similarly, teaches people what the rules are, how to follow the rules, what not to do, and how to stay out of trouble. But what states and governments and procurement organizations often fail to do is focus on the outcome. I can follow the rules, but to what end? What am I trying to do with all of these rules? Why do I have these rules? Or more importantly, how do I know when my system is working well, and how do I know when my system is performing poorly? What we find in practice is following the rules is not enough. I will give you examples later of situations where we follow all of the rules and have a disastrous or a terrible outcome. So, as a lawyer, I agree with you that the rules are important. But as a citizen and as someone who is part of a government, I know that what really matters is the outcome of each individual procurement. So I need to think strategically throughout the process. I know that I need to obtain the goods and services that my state needs to function. I also know that I need to spend my public funds wisely. And I'll know when I'm succeeding if my government is able to operate efficiently and provide the necessary goods and services that the public needs. Now, as was mentioned earlier, I would love to welcome your questions at any time, while I'm talking or later during this presentation or during the afternoon or tomorrow. I would much rather be talking about the things that you're interested in rather than just talking. Because as you're going to see, okay, you've already seen, I can talk all day. I talk for a living. I could talk for the rest of the day. And if you don't interrupt me, I'll just keep talking. So please, if there are things that you're interested in, if you'd like clarifications, or if you have examples, please let me know. And now, if it's okay, I'm going to take off my coat. It's a little warm. Okay. Oh, I even have a pointer. It's so exciting. This is just to keep your eyes awake. All right, again. Policies. Why do we do what we do? Strategies. How do we plan to achieve the goals that we've thought about in terms of our policies? Objectives. What are we trying to do? Measuring or metrics. How am I going to look at my own performance to figure out if I'm meeting my objectives? And then on top of all of that, I want to introduce some discussion of the issue of sustainability. Because whether we like it or not, in the next decade, your country, my country, the citizens of this planet are going to have to do something to make life as we know it sustainable for our children and their children. And frankly, in my country, we're not doing enough, and we don't talk about it enough, but we need to rethink the way we do procurement also, like everything else in our lives, as we embrace the need for sustainability in everything that we do. Okay. I am assuming that what I talk about for the next few minutes is going to be familiar to all of you. I'm going to do this mostly so that we can share our vocabulary or our definitions or our nomenclature, or so you can understand where I'm drawing the box and what's inside the box and what's outside the box. For most of this, I'm going to use the experience of global best practices, what most states do, rather than necessarily what one individual state does. Okay, so let me begin. When I say public procurement, I'm using the broadest possible definition of procurement. So basically what I'm talking about is when a government obtains goods or services. And I really don't care how they get those goods or services for the purposes of this definition. Let me also pause here and briefly mention there is a fair amount of disagreement around the world as to what is procurement and what isn't procurement. So for example, if we were in China, there would be a massive discussion about whether state-owned enterprises are part of procurement or not part of procurement. We don't need to worry about that today. My definition, to be inclusive, is any time the government reaches out to the private sector to gain some kind of resources it doesn't have for the purposes of governing. Now, goods and services. When I say a good, I tend to mean a supply, or the definition that's frequently used in the United States is a good or a supply is anything that can be moved. And so it can be something small, like a writing instrument or a laptop computer. It could be an automobile, it could be a truck or an airplane. And some of the largest goods are things like ships or even an aircraft carrier. But anything that I can move, anything that isn't affixed to the earth, that isn't human capital, I'm going to call a good or a supply. Services, I think, is the easiest. The definition that we tend to use is a service is human capital. Anything that I can buy by the hour, by the day, the week, or the month. It can be intellectual capacity, it can be labor, but it's something that I can't put my hands on, it's not affixed to the earth, but it's something that's normally quantified by human labor. One of the most interesting issues around the world is how we define construction or public works. In the United States, we define construction as any improvement to real property. So it's a building, but if I destroy a building, if I blow it up or take it apart, I call that construction because I'm improving the real property. If I dredge out my port, if I'm digging the ground out under the water, I call that construction. The broader definition around the world, however, is public works. And public works often straddles construction and services. And when we talk later about public-private partnerships and infrastructure projects, many of these typically fall under the definition of public works, but are not necessarily limited to construction. One reason I mention that is because the United States, which is a leader in many areas of procurement, is a full generation behind the rest of the world on public-private partnerships. There are some spectacular public-private partnerships going on in Brazil right now, and in Asia, and in Africa, and in the United States, we're just very far behind. Okay, research and development. On the one hand, research and development sounds like a service, and pure research, the kind that's typically conducted at universities, is often described as a service. But as you may know, if you think about your iPhone or your laptop or any piece of technology that you buy, part of developing research is building prototypes and testing them. So there's more to it than simply the human capital. So we tend to group research and development as a phased form of transition from service to typically goods. Another interesting issue is rental or lease. As a general rule in the United States, we think of as rentals and leases as procurement, but the government's actually borrowing rather than necessarily purchasing, because in a rental or a lease situation, we don't include ownership. But for our discussion today, I want to include all of these things in public procurement. Okay. The next, if you're in the room today, I assume you already know this. Why does procurement matter? It matters because it's a lot of money. You've already heard the statistics on what percentage it is of your gross domestic product. But one of the realities for your government and my government, and today, almost every government in the world, is governments cannot fulfill their objectives without relying on the private sector. So if we need the private sector to provide healthcare services, to provide infrastructure and transportation, for national defense and for education, it is important for us to understand that everything the government does in some ways requires our procurement system to operate efficiently. Or another way to think of it, and we'll talk a lot about this later, is if our procurement system works well and we spend our money more wisely, we'll get more miles or kilometers of roads for the same amount or less money. We'll have higher standards of public health, our food will be safer, our children will be better educated, and maybe we'll be safer at our borders and in our homes. But when our government procurement systems don't work well, then we can't provide the services that we need, and what ends up happening is we spend the same money over and over again getting results that don't help us. Okay, so we all knew all that stuff anyway. Let's now open up our global conversation about policy today. Let me also say that one of the most exciting things that's happened in my life, and again, I'm getting a little old at this point, so little things matter to me, but I spent the first 40 years of my life focusing exclusively on United States public procurement. We spend $500 billion a year buying goods and services and construction. And there was plenty to keep me busy in the United States. And then in about 1998, I started working with other countries, and to some extent the timing was very lucky, but between the internet, which was really a good thing for all of us in some ways, a terrible thing in some others, but between the internet, travel, and some of our major global trading instruments, for the first time in the world, everyone began talking to each other about procurement. In 1998, if I had just done the slide I did earlier, we would not have agreed on basic definitions, and we used a different vocabulary. Today, almost all states and almost all international organizations look at procurement very, very similarly. So we've come a long way in the last 20 to 21 years. Okay, Next, let me try to do this relatively briefly, but I think it's important to remember that if we want the best of our procurement systems, we have to think of ourselves as part of the global community. Let me also say, and again, I'll do it as a form of apology, I'm not trying to use the United States as an example on this right now. This is not one of the great periods in the history of the United States. Our positions on trade are neither well thought out or sustainable in the long run, and I hope that this will be a short-term step in the wrong direction. But if we think about where we've come and where we're going, we're all part of the same global community. So, whether we like it or not, markets are global. I understand that Intel is in the community today, but I look out and I look at the laptops you all have on your desks, and I notice the phones that you have on your pockets, and that's a pretty good reminder that we are all dependent upon global, multinational firms doing business in global markets, learning from each other, and trying to provide good competitive solutions to difficult problems. I was interested in my tourism over the weekend to see that the grand empire of Starbucks has now come to Costa Rica, but I was interested in learning that Starbucks, when they came to Costa Rica, did something here they've never done before. As you may know, Starbucks, for their entire history, just bought coffee from other producers. They've come here for the first time to learn from you as to how to use the best practices in farming and developing to improve their practices. So even the evil empire Starbucks knows they have to go abroad to get the best information from the experts. The big firms, they're international now. I drive on your streets and I recognize most of the brands of automobiles and motorcycles. We fly a very, very small number of airplanes around the world. But we all understand that the biggest, most sophisticated firms operate across borders because it makes sense for them and for the global community. But the one that the public has the most difficulty understanding is the concept of the global supply chain. There are no major corporations, and there are very, very few things that states buy that aren't dependent upon firms buying from other firms that are in other countries. And when my president is at his worst and he's talking about Buy American, he has no idea what he's talking about. He wants you to buy an American car because he doesn't understand that 70% of the components came from manufacturers outside the United States, and that the best technology is never going to be located in a single country. Different countries, different communities have different levels of expertise. And so the global supply chain is a fact of life if we want access to the best technology and the best manufacturing capacities. Finally, and here's the thing that my president doesn't understand, and when I look at the United Kingdom and I watch Brexit and it makes me sick to my stomach, what we find is that the populist anti-trade movement doesn't understand the law of nature. Whether we like it or not, regardless of what we say, money is going to move across borders. Where does the money go? The money goes where the opportunities are being created. Governments can't stop that. The history of the world is long enough for us to know that if the best tea is in China, the money will go to China. If the best flowers are in Holland, that's where the money will go during that period. If the best aircraft are going to be in Europe or the United States, that's where people are going to buy aircraft. And if Brazil makes a bigger commercial jetliner, the money's going to go to Brazil. You can't stop the flow of money because it will go where the opportunities are. Similarly, Governments can't control information. They've been trying forever, and no government has ever succeeded. Love the internet or hate the internet, this has made it even more difficult to control information, but for the same reasons, technology and people move across borders. The only reason that I harp on this briefly is that for our procurement systems to succeed, we have to make ourselves open to the best firm, the best talent, the best processes from around the world. What that often means is we need to be open to working in different languages with firms that are not located in our capital cities or nearby. And that is often very, very difficult for politicians and leaders and legislators to understand. But at the end of the day, remember, we're talking about markets here because the government is relying on the private sector, not vice versa. Okay. The next point I want to make is just to emphasize how much smaller the world has gotten in the last 20 to 21 years. One of the most interesting things that's happened in the world is the growth and the familiarity of the World Trade Organization's Government Procurement Agreement. The World Trade Organization Government Procurement Agreement. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that the World Trade Organization's Government Procurement Agreement involves everyone in the world, but it does involve most of the major trading nations, and many states that are not actual members have observer status. But the reason that I put it first is it has increasingly become, particularly in the last 15 years, the most simple and concise collection of global best practices in procurement. In other words, what the Government Procurement Agreement does today is it articulates for the major trading players what procurement principles we all agree on. And so as a point of consistency, it's a very handy document to see what states do in procurement. Now, it's a very low bar, and it has plenty of imperfections. But as a starting point, it is increasingly pointed to as the one document that most countries around the world agree with. All right, let's also use the example of the European Union. Remember, it was not so long ago that the European Union did not try to manage procurement across a continent. And I'm not saying they're doing a great job, but it's fascinating to have watched over the last 20 years a number of very different states and cultures and languages come together to agree on basic procurement principles. And what do we find? They're very, very similar to the rules that the WTO members agree to. And similarly, the United Nations, that has a model law on public procurement and has revised that a couple times now, their principles now are basically the same. So what we see is around the world a growing convergence or a harmonization or agreement as to the way we should be approaching that. The biggest breakthrough, however, was the World Bank. Very briefly on this, as many of you probably know, for many years the World Bank believed that the touchstone or the coin of the realm in procurement was low price wins. They liked objectivity. They didn't like subjective outcomes. They didn't want buyers to have too much discretion. So they fought the value for money movement for decades. They've finally given up. The World Bank a couple of years ago updated their procurement regulations, and now, like the rest of the world, they're basically following the same concepts that the other states do as well. In other words, my point again is most states around the world have agreed on the basics of how good procurement works. Oh, I do want to mention one other thing. I mentioned before why trade makes sense. Let me also make sure I mention two other things. When we close our markets, what we typically do is we end up spending more money and we get lower quality. But the other thing that's been interesting, and there's more and more research on this, is that when we close our markets to foreign competitors, it often makes it easier for our domestic competitors to take advantage of us. In other words, in the United States, when we didn't permit the Europeans to compete for some of our work, the American firms charged us too much, they didn't work as hard on their quality, and they were far more willing to collude or cooperate against themselves to take advantage of the government. Once you bring inside that outside competition, it's much more difficult to have collusion and corruption in the marketplace. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, but I do think it's where the world's going. Okay. Now, I realize that many of you are sitting in the back. I understand my students try to sit as far from me as possible. So I realize this is probably too small. But let me just say, what I think most countries agree on as to what we're trying to do in procurement is, at the end of the day, first and foremost, we're trying to govern. We're trying to do the things that the government has to do, and frequently, the government in power is trying to stay in power. In other words, they're trying to avoid a scandal, they're trying to avoid a collapse, they're trying to avoid lack of confidence in the public. They're trying to deliver the goods we need, public works, and services. Now, having said that, there is no government in the world that has too much money. Not so many years ago, we used to point to the Arab states. We would say, but in Saudi Arabia, they have enough money to do everything they need. As you may know, Aramco is going public now. Even the Arab states don't have all the money they need. So the reality is, we need to do the things we need to do for our public, but we do it with a limited amount of money. In other words, as we spend our money more efficiently, we can provide more services or better services to the public, or possibly even reduce taxes for the public. In all of this, however, what we're trying to do is cooperate with the private sector without letting the private sector govern, because at the end of the day, the government is responsible for the state, and the private sector is responsible for itself. The private sector is not responsible to the public in the same way the government is. And then, of course, oftentimes we're trying to achieve other policies, and one of the most common things that our states are trying to do is build up our domestic capacity so that they can export and grow around the world. All of these things are relatively common. Okay, so now let's think a little bit more broadly about how all of that translates to policy in public procurement. I hope by now we're in agreement on this. Why do governments buy? We buy because we need goods or services or construction or public works to do our mission. Let's think about the opposite just for a second. As a general rule, states do not do procurement just so they can spend money. Spending money is not necessarily a good in and of itself. The reason that I ask this, however, is I want you to come back to this every time we think about another objective. For example, in public procurement, does our legislature frequently tell us that we should be purchasing to support our domestic small and medium enterprise, or SMEs? That's a policy also, right? We purchase to create opportunities. Yes, but remember what our starting point is. If we're ever involved in procurement and we're not achieving a particular government objective, I suggest that we're lost. And this is something we do in the United States all the time. Okay. Now I need you to think for just a second. Before I ask this question, my suggestion to you is one of the most common mistakes we make in procurement is we think about a process that ends when a contract is awarded. So I'll come back to that in just a second. But the World Trade Organization's government procurement agreement, I told you that it wasn't perfect and it has problems. The biggest problem with it, to my mind, is it begins with acquisition planning. It goes through advertising, competition, evaluation, award, and review, and then it stops. Okay? One of the things that I hope you take away from our discussion today and tomorrow is that a contract is like a relationship. All right? Stay with me for a second here. How many of you either believe or know someone who believed that in life their greatest achievement was getting married? They spent their whole life preparing for their wedding. And then when they had the wedding, they spent a fortune on the dresses and the outfits. They had a beautiful reception. They spent a lot of money. There was a big party. Everyone went home happy, and they declared victory. I just want you to stop and remind yourselves, and many of you know this, that after the wedding, the hard work begins. Managing a marriage is a challenging, daunting, evolving process where both parties have to compromise and evolve together, or they will fail. All a contract is a relationship. It may be a relationship defined by words on a page, and it may not be as sophisticated as a marriage. But it is an exchange of promises between two parties. The government promises to pay money to the private sector in exchange for a good or a service or a work. But if you don't manage this relationship, the odds that you're both going to get out of the relationship what you want are incredibly low. So, the main theme that I'm going to keep coming back to time and time again is that outcomes matter more than process. The process of finding the perfect mate, courting or dating or learning about each other, and then eventually negotiating and getting to the point where you have that marriage, that's what we often think of as the procurement process. But that's not the outcome. Awarding a contract in and of itself is not a successful outcome. It's the beginning of a relationship. Okay. Against that backdrop, what I'm going to suggest to you is the most common mistake made around the world in procurement. We do it in my country, you do it in your country. I have yet to visit a country where this is not a problem. We take our very best people in procurement and we train them to be buyers. And what they do is they do market research, they craft solicitations, they negotiate, they evaluate, they award contracts, and then they stop. My point to you is that we need to invest more money and more people and more strategy and more training in managing the relationship after the contract has been awarded. I'll give you some disastrous examples later. But first, here's my question to you, okay? Assume now that I've awarded a contract and I've put you individually in charge of that contract. So you are my government representative, my contract manager. What's your job? Okay? What's your job? What's the purpose or the goal? What are you trying to do in managing that contract on behalf of the government? In other words, how do you know if you've done a good job or a bad job? Quick story. A number of years ago, I was in Entebbe in Uganda. Relatively long flight for me, but I was down there with a large United Nations program on contract management. So just managing contracts after they're awarded. And as you know, the United Nations buys a lot of unique things. 3 things of interest to me. The United Nations buys a lot of sport utility vehicles because they drive in difficult places. The United Nations is one of the highest per capita consumers of arms-bearing contractors. They buy a lot of security work. But one of the things that's really interesting is the United Nations buys basically mobile medical units. They drop medical teams into horrible places and set up triage and surgery units in crisis areas. So these are very sophisticated procurements. So now assume you're managing one of these contracts. How do you know whether you're doing a good job or not? Well, we ended up taking a little bit of a survey among the United Nations people that were there, and they basically divided themselves down the middle into two basic camps. One of the camps said, my job is to ensure that the contractor delivers on their promises. In other words, I have a written contract. My responsibility to my client, my government organization, is to ensure that the contractor does everything they promised to do in the written contract. Okay? Does that make sense? Sure. The other side of the room, in effect, said, I don't care what the contract said. My only purpose is to ensure that my client, my government agency, gets the goods or the services they need to achieve their government mission. If the contract is written badly, or if I need to fix the contract, it's my job to make sure that the government gets the goods or services they need. Now, there's a lot of overlap between the two of them. But I think that one of the hardest things for us to keep in mind is we need a little bit of both. If we want the right outcome, we need to make sure that the words on the page describe what we really want, and they give us the flexibility to get what we need. But we also need to ensure that even a perfectly managed contract, where the contractor does everything they said they were going to do, if the contractor does what the contract says and the government doesn't get what it actually needs, I don't think that's a very good contract. And I'm going to come back to that at some length a little bit later. So I want you to be thinking about the outcome in terms of ensuring the government gets the goods or services they need to perform their mission. Okay. Now, imagine you've been very unlucky in life, or imagine you've been bad and now you're going to be punished. So they send you to Washington, D.C., and you have to spend an entire year in my graduate program, okay? Believe it or not, some people actually pay for this. This is the way that we start our program every year. There's an interesting story behind it, which you may or may not be amused by, but back when I was still at the White House in the 1990s, China, a relatively large country, as we all know, decided that they were going to completely start over in public procurement. And so they sent a letter to the White House, they sent a similar letter to the United Kingdom, and they sent another one to Singapore. And they said, we are just beginning our effort to craft a new public procurement law. We're going to bring together 500 people from across the country. We're going to have a 2-day conference, and we want you to come and tell us what to think about as we begin this journey. But they said, do not tell us what to do. We're not interested in you telling us what to do. Tell us what to think about. Tell us what we should be trying to achieve. Don't tell us what to do. This was, in many ways, a life change for me. In the United States, I knew more rules than anyone. I was the rule expert. I knew how to tell people what to do and what not to do. But we didn't talk about what we were supposed to think about. Do this, don't do that. This was my job. So we started over, and I brought my staff together, and that's ultimately what led to this exercise. Now, let me just be clear. This is a summary that we use in our academic program, and I have an article that goes along with it. But the words can be changed, and there's a fair amount of agreement as to these basic principles because this conversation has come a long way over the last 20 years. But the way that we began back in 1998 is we started what we referred to as a three-legged stool, or three basic principles that we thought were critical in all procurement systems, okay? The three. The first was transparency. And you've already heard a little bit about transparency today, but when we say transparency, we mean that you can see through the process. So obviously, transparency is the opposite of being opaque. Or as we say to our children, a window is transparent, a door or a wall is opaque. Okay, why is transparency so important? Transparency is important because we're spending public money. Transparency is important because the marketplace doesn't know how to do business with us if we don't tell them how we do business. We cannot regulate ourselves, and we cannot regulate others if we're not transparent. If you think about the global best practices on transparencies, we advertise our solicitations, we advertise the results of our contracts, we publish our rules, we explain our procedures, we tend to have challenge or appeals processes, and we give the results. All of these things are part of transparency. But that's just the beginning. If I'm trying to purchase a public work or a sophisticated device, if I don't explain my technical specifications, if I don't explain what I need and why I need it, and what it has to cooperate with or fit against, there's no way the private sector can meet my needs. But as you know, governments generally don't like to share information. If you're following the news in the United States, I have a president that doesn't want to share any information. And when he does share the information, it tends to be untrue. Transparency is incredibly important if we're actually going to do business with our business partners. The last part of this, and it comes around, is if we want to manage corruption, we're going to have oversight, and we can only do oversight if we have transparency. Okay, let me skip here. Competition. There are many in my country who believe that my nation was founded on capitalism rather than democracy. It may or may not be true. But in public procurement, the ultimate belief is that markets work. The way that we get the best value for money is by letting the private sector compete. In other words, if I want to drive my prices down or push my quality standards up, the only way I can do that is if the firm that I'm doing business with today is worried about losing that business to somebody else. Because the minute they're not worried about losing my business, they start innovating somewhere else and they stop trying to reduce my costs. So competition is incredibly important, particularly as we think about innovation. All right, now let me double back. I use the word integrity. Some people like the word accountability. We use compliance if we want a positive term, but frankly, what we're talking about is corruption control. Your government is spending money. Money makes people behave badly. It makes my children behave badly. It makes the private sector behave badly. It makes government officials behave badly. Corruption in procurement is a massive problem. We may not like to talk about it, but it is what it is. No nation has conquered corruption in procurement. Many states have done a better job, but everyone faces the same problem. But if you follow procurement history around the world, more state governments have collapsed or been overthrown based on procurement scandals or fraud than war. So if you just think about that, the odds of a government collapsing is more likely to occur based on poor spending than it is because of losing a war to their neighbor. That's a little bit scary in the modern era. But we all need to focus on corruption control. We go full circle. It's impossible to manage corruption without having some level of transparency, and we can often reduce corruption if we increase competition because, again, the ability of a closed market to cooperate against itself is reduced the minute I bring in outside competitors who often, with competition, are going to drive down prices and raise quality. Okay, so these are our basic starting points. Most governments around the world originally designed their procurement systems around competition, corruption control, and transparency. Okay, now it gets a little bit more interesting. What if I told you that historically, the most common driver in procurement policy was corruption control? The thinking goes something like this. I'm a government, and I need to do a lot of purchasing. In order to do purchasing, I'm going to need a lot of procurement officials. They're going to be civil servants or government employees, and I may need hundreds of them or thousands of them, and they're going to be spending public money. The minute I let thousands of people start spending public money, I have a management problem because their incentive to award contracts to their relatives or their friends or to take bribes or to steal the money themselves is very, very high. So most governments originally designed their procurement systems to be objective and transparent. Why was low price wins such a common standard in public procurement? It's objective. It's a number anybody can check. An auditor can figure out whether I awarded the contract to the lowest price bidder or to a family member. That's easy. And so what happened is, and it's true in my country and others as well, is many early procurement systems were designed to be very transparent, very rule-oriented, very objective, and ultimately driven by low price wins because they were worried about corruption. This brings up the issue of uniformity. Many procurement systems try to be relatively uniform or consistent. Why? Well, rules are complicated, and the more rules I have, the more training I have to do. And the more training I have to do for my government people, the more complicated it gets to the private sector. So, should I make all of my agencies or ministries or departments buy the same way? Should I buy goods the way that I buy services? Should I buy, again, using the same processes for everything? The advantage of uniformity is I have to change my laws less often. I can spend a lot less money training, and the public sector knows exactly how I behave. What's the downside of uniformity? The problem with uniformity is most of us don't want to buy goods the way we buy services. We don't want to buy public works the way we buy commodities or off-the-shelf commercial products. So this tends to be a double-edged sword. Now, before I start moving down, let me go back to the beginning as to why this discussion matters in the first place. In procurement, like in life, you can't have everything you want. And as we'll talk about in just a few moments, everything on this list is a valid goal or a constraint or a procurement policy. But you can't have all of them. And the more you want of one, normally the more you have to give up of another one. So now it starts getting complicated. All right. When I design my procurement system with my highest goal being corruption control, my procurement officials understand that message. If you train your procurement officials and you tell them that the main thing we're worried about is not having fraud or theft, then what happens is my procurement officials become rule followers. They know that they get in trouble when they make mistakes. They know that the easiest thing to do is to just follow the rules. The problem, as we'll see with risk avoidance, is it makes them overly cautious. They don't want to take a chance. But when you're buying technology, or you're buying services, or you want to innovate, oftentimes we want greater flexibility, and we want people to think like business people, not like policemen. So we'll come back to that too. All right, now it gets really exciting. In your country or in my country, the legislature thinks, oh, I'm spending 12%, 16% of my GDP in procurement. Maybe I can effectuate some other policies with that. If I'm spending all this money in procurement, that money should go to my domestic businesses. I should be building up my domestic industry. In addition, that money should go to support my small and medium enterprise as well. In addition, I may want to mandate certain behaviors of the firms that do business with me. Here's the interesting problem with all that. There is no study that has ever been done in the world that any of these policies work. Okay? Your government does it, my government does it, every government in the world does it. We have domestic preference policies, but we know that economically world trade makes more sense. We know that we want to support our small and medium enterprises, but we know that the best technology is with the big multinational firms. The reality is that while there are many policies that we often superimpose on our procurement system, what we really end up doing is we end up hiding the costs of those policies. I'll come back to that later. Okay, now, as you'll see, the colors start to shift. Somewhere between the 1980s and the 1990s into the 2000s, the conversation around the world started changing. And we started talking about value for money, or what some call best value. In other words, what governments started realizing is that their original policies on corruption control, which led people to be risk averse, meant they were awarding contracts to the lowest price bidder or the lowest price tenderer. So let's stop real quick. All right, show of hands, a little bit of exercise, everybody, okay? Ready? How many of you can think of something that you buy on a regular basis other than gasoline or petrol? Think of at least one thing that you buy where the only thing that you care about is the lowest price, okay? All right, how many people can think of at least one thing? Okay? How many people make most of their procurement decisions with an eye towards the lowest price with nothing else being considered? No. Okay, how many of you would agree to buy the cheapest laptop on the market without any other considerations? How many of you go out and purchase the cheapest clothing available without regard to style or comfort? How many of you purchase the least expensive automobile manufactured in the world? It's probably made in India, may not be very safe, but you want the cheapest automobile in the world. You don't buy your food that way. You don't buy your clothes that way. You don't buy your technology. By the way, how many of you would agree, if you were having open heart surgery, to choose the cheapest doctor in the world, regardless of anything else? If you were purchasing child care, how many of you would be willing to put an advertisement in the newspaper or on the internet that says, I'm looking to hire the cheapest person, the least expensive person in the world to take care of my children? That's not the way we think. That's not consumer behavior. We all have some consideration of value in our assessment. How can it be then that our procurement systems locked ourselves into a focus on low price first? It's unnatural. It was easy It was objective, it helped us control corruption, but it led to risk avoidance. Today we know that we need to make a trade-off. We have to take into consideration the quality part of the equation. We know that we pay more. We pay a price premium for quality. We're willing to pay more for clothes that fit better and look better and last longer. We're willing to pay more for an automobile that's more comfortable or more fuel efficient or safer or faster or more stylish. We're willing to pay someone more to help renovate our homes or repair our roads if they're going to get the work done more quickly or it's going to last longer. This is all common sense, but it's only in the last 20 to 30 years we've been having this conversation in procurement. Okay. Next, I want to go to the issue of efficiency, which was also mentioned this morning. How many people have some economics training in the room? At least one course in economics at any level. Okay. Transaction costs. I grew up in a world where procurement systems totally ignored the concept of transaction costs. We had rules, but we didn't care how much it cost to implement those rules. When we use the term efficiency, there's a number of different types of efficiencies, but I want you to think about the administrative efficiency or the transaction cost. In other words, how much money do we waste running our procurement systems? One of the more interesting experiments in my lifetime in the United States is we, in the 1990s, for the first time, permitted our procurement officials to use purchase cards or charge cards, just like consumers. And we started with a very, very low level, $2,500 at the time. We called it the micro purchase level. And we did that because we did some research and we found that it was very, very common when the government was buying inexpensive items, like a hammer or maybe office supplies. We would often spend 10 times the value of the item just going through the process of our procurement rules. In other words, our transaction costs were through the roof and we weren't focused on administrative efficiency. All right, now, just remember, why are all these things on the screen? Because you can't have everything. Transparency and competition. These are good things, right? But let's also be clear, they're not the most efficient solution. If I have no competition, I can get by with fewer purchasers. I don't have to do all of that advertising. I don't have to do all of the evaluation. If I know what I want, the most efficient solution is to just go to an individual vendor. But remember, we're constantly trading off, so what we need to do is figure out how to be more efficient and reduce our transaction costs while still keeping some of the things that we think are important. But now I get to my absolute favorite. One of my hopes in my lifetime, and I'm not overly optimistic on this, but what I hope is that when my children's children talk about procurement, they're going to invert this chart, and the thing that's going to be at the top is customer satisfaction. This actually amuses me to no end. In the United States, where we have decades of procurement, we have the largest public procurement system in the world. We never talked about customer satisfaction until the last 10 to 15 years. We talked about being transparent, we talked about controlling corruption, we talked about competition, but nobody ever stopped to ask whether the government was happy with the goods or the services that they bought. Now, I'm going to come back to this later, but I suggest to you, and just think about this just for a second, when you spend your own money, when you reach into your pocket or your wallet or your purse, and you take out your own hard-earned money or you use a charge card, the next day, how do you assess whether you're happy with your purchase? I suggest you only care about two things. Did you get what you want, and do you feel like you got good value for your money? That's the way normal consumers think. Did I get what I want? Am I happy with it? Did I get it for a reasonable amount of money? That's not the way procurement systems were designed. And even worse, most public procurement systems around the world still don't talk about customer satisfaction. And we don't talk about customer satisfaction because it's scary and it's hard, but worse, it's difficult to measure. It's not objective. I'm going to come back to some examples with that. All right, then on top of all of that, we have this new issue of sustainability. The idea that in the next 10 years, we may so greatly continue to damage the planet that our grandchildren won't have a planet as they know it. Maybe we should do something about that. So one of the things that I'll talk about is we need to be thinking about sustainability, making good decisions in everything that we do. In other words, we need to rethink what we mean about value for money. A less expensive automobile that puts more carbon into the atmosphere may not be a bargain. Or in other words, it may be worth it as a government to pay more for an environmentally cleaner or sustainable solution. And again, this is going to impact competition. When the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, when they began presenting their sustainability agenda, the Chinese firms immediately said, this is a ruse. They basically said, you're trying to introduce sustainability into public procurement to exclude Chinese firms. We know that if you compete only on low price, we have a market advantage. And so what you're trying to do is create opportunities for the overpriced Western firms that have invested in technology that we haven't invested in. Now, you can agree with that or disagree with that, but the only way that we're going to achieve our sustainability objectives is if we begin to describe our requirements as, I need this good or I need this service to provide this particular service to my constituency or my public. But I am also cognizant it is a priority of mine to not harm the planet more than I need to. So I'm willing to pay a price premium to do less damage or to have a more efficient solution. But I can tell you, for my generation and for older procurement officials, we weren't trained to think that way. We were trained to think that low price is the ultimate answer. And so this is going to require a tremendous amount of change. All right. Now, I want to take all of that and let's make it real now. A quick disclosure. There's a great conversation going on around the world today about procurement measurement. Have any of you heard about the open data movement, the open contracting folks? Okay. They're doing wonderful stuff. And they're getting a global consensus as to how we should be approaching procurement data. But the biggest holdout right now is still the United States. And one of the reasons that we have not been participating as much as we should in the open contracting movement is we have more procurement data than any country in the world. We've been collecting procurement data for more than 70 years. And we have more data on more types of procurement than anybody. But we're locked into a system. And more than anything else, what I want you to take away from this discussion is, just because we have more data doesn't mean that we know anything, okay? What we have done for the last 70 years is we have measured what is easy to measure, and we have failed to measure what matters. The open contracting movement is struggling with this, and we talk with them a lot, and I think they're moving in the right direction. But what I want you to start thinking about in terms of your procurement reform is what data do you want? Not what data are you planning to collect. What data do you need to know whether your system is working or not? And let me suggest to you, this is actually quite difficult, and it's going to require a fair amount of change. Let me also tell you something that I think most of you know. Whatever you measure is what you get. Every psychological study of human nature that has ever been made is when people know they're being studied, they perform better. If you think you're being watched, you do what you're supposed to do. If you think you're not being watched, you don't. If you tell your procurement officials that the thing you care most about is low price, you'll get low price. All right? If you tell your procurement officials that the thing you care most about is sustainability, you'll get sustainability. All right? But you have to make sure that people know what you want and that you measure it, and this is hard. All right. I'm going to get a little bit more specific on this, so bear with me. All right. There's a lot going on in this chart. I'm going to start over here, and I do this mostly for historical purposes. Take my word for it that the United States has more procurement data than any country in the world. And if you're already bored with me, I know they have Wi-Fi in the room, you can go to usaspending.gov, usaspending.gov. Not only do we have more data than any country in the world, we put it on the internet. We make beautiful charts in something called datalab.gov, datalab.gov. So between usaspending.gov and datalab.gov, you can see all of our data in beautiful, colorful charts. And I'm telling you right now, it's all garbage. But we have a lot of it. We have more garbage data than any country in the world. How did that happen? We've been following and measuring procurement for a long time. So the data that we have, we know how many transactions we have. We know how many big transactions, how many little transactions. It's very common in the United States to have more than 22 million procurement transactions a year. It's a lot of transactions, all right? We know how many. We also know who the contracts are awarded to, which companies, where they're located. You can look on our webpage too. We even know which legislative district the contractors are located in, because the members of our legislature like to brag how many government contracts were awarded in their jurisdiction, okay? So we have lots of data on that. All right. We know a lot of information about how much money we spent also. So how much money we spent across the government, how much money each government ministry or department or office spent. We know the value of individual transactions. We know the difference between the amount the contract was awarded for and the amount that it was finally finished for. We know whether the amount that we spent was less than the market price or more than the market price. We know how many competitors there were and how the price that we awarded was in terms of everyone who competed. So we have lots of data on the money. Another fun one. We have 70 years of data as to how frequently the contractor completes the work on time and how often they're late. They're never early, okay? But we know whether they were on time, whether they were late, or how late they were. Another one of my favorites, we know whether the contractor did exactly what they promised to do in the contract or whether they failed to meet individual specifications in the contract. So whether it's weight or volume or speed, we know whether they did what they said they would do or whether they failed and by how much. And then we have staggering amounts of data on the redistribution of wealth. As a general rule in the United States, our legislature requires that we spend 23% of our contracting dollars in contracts with small and medium enterprises. Just out of curiosity, how much money do you think we spend that goes to small and medium enterprises each year? Anybody want to guess? 23%. Because the government knows exactly what the minimum is, and that's how much they award. But because the legislature cares, and they don't want to get in trouble, and they don't want to be yelled at by the legislature, they don't want to be under 23%. So they try to get as close to the 23% as possible. So we know how many dollars went to small businesses, how many dollars went to small businesses owned by disadvantaged demographic groups. We know how many dollars go to women-owned businesses, how many dollars go to businesses run by veterans, how many dollars go to Native American businesses, how many go to women-owned minority businesses. We have data on how many dollars in contracts go to firms that are located in urban areas of high unemployment. We have all of this data, okay? What have I not said we have data on? We have no idea if we got what we needed. We have no idea if the stuff worked. We have no idea if we used it. We have no idea whether the customer was happy with what they bought. In other words, we have no basic consumer information whatsoever. Okay, now, before I transition into where we're trying to go, let me just give you a hypothetical story. To put this in context, I need you to make a big assumption. Just assume for a moment that I'm a nice person. You already know better. Now also assume that I have now been married for 30 years. I got married a little bit late, but it's worked out okay. But assume I've been married for 30 years at this point. Big 30th anniversary is coming up, and I've decided I'm going to buy an automobile for my wife. I'm an academic, I'm a geek, I love to do research, and obviously I have too much time on my hands. I do research to determine what is the best automobile in the world. I search far and wide, but ultimately my research leads me to conclude that the finest automobile in the world today is the Tesla. It might cost $110,000, which is a lot of money, but it's beautiful, it's comfortable, it's environmentally friendly, it drives very, very well, it's very, very safe, and all of the independent testing agencies have determined this is the best automobile in the world. I'm very excited. So I go out shopping for a Tesla. And remember, I'm an academic, I do research, I have far too much time on my hands, so I go to all of the Tesla dealers and I negotiate. And I keep negotiating until they're sick of me. And eventually I wear one of them down and I end up buying that Tesla for less money than any consumer in the world has ever paid for one before. I have just bought the best automobile in the world for the lowest price anyone's ever paid for it. Okay, now, come to my home near DC. It's the day of my anniversary. My wife is driving home. She pulls onto our street. I have a remote garage door opener. I open the remote on the garage door opens up, and there's a brand new Tesla, which I present to my wife for our anniversary, the best car in the world for the lowest price ever. And my wife turns to me and says, I'm not driving that car. In the United States, I am the world's greatest procuring official. I did everything I was supposed to do. I followed the rules. I had a great procurement. by any objective measure, I was awesome. But for my customer, I'm a moron. I'm a loser. Okay? This is a fundamental problem. Now, this is a silly story. Let's be honest. I can't afford a Tesla, okay? But still, all the data that we have in the procurement is on stuff that doesn't matter. It's political. It's objective. It's utterly irrelevant to consumers. What do consumers care about? Value for money expended. Did I get good value for my money? All right, real quick. Pick something that you've had for more than a few months. Your laptop, your phone, your automobile, the clothes you're wearing, or even pick a dinner or a trip you had recently. How concerned are you today whether a year ago someone else got that for less money than you did? Does that matter to you? Or are you concerned today whether you think that the money you spent got you something of value that you needed? The objective things don't matter. You just want to know, for the amount of money that I spent, did I get what I wanted or what I needed? Now, this is very, very important. What I'm about to do is open the door to one of the biggest problems we have in procurement, and that is, if procurement ends with the award of the contract, the only number that we really have is the purchase price, okay? You bought a laptop. You're going to keep that laptop for 3 years, maybe 5, maybe if you're lucky, 7 or 8. How much information do you have on the day you bought the laptop as to whether you got value for money or not? You may go home thinking, I bought this laptop for less money than my neighbor, okay? But I suggest to you, you don't really know as to whether you had a good procurement until you find out whether the laptop worked for 1 year or 3 years or 7 years, and whether you liked it or whether you found it so difficult to use that you ended up using something else instead, okay? And that's going to bring us to the issue of life cycle cost or total cost of ownership. And this is difficult, but this really matters. Okay, let me go to customer satisfaction. In the private sector today, the private sector understands that in a competitive marketplace, customer satisfaction is everything. You buy a new car, before you even get home, the auto manufacturer has sent you an email basically saying, do you like your new car? What do you like about it? What can we do to make it better? 6 months later, do you still like your new car? How's it working out for you? A year later, why do they keep emailing you? They want to sell you another car. They want to make their car better so that you like their car better than their competitors. All right? Everything that we do. Why has so much of the internet been dominated by customer experience? Because the marketplace craves that information. They want to know whether you like your hotel, whether you like your food, everything that you buy. In public procurement, we are a full generation behind the public sector in this regard, and we need to think more proactively about it. All right, now let me add this one to it. As we focus on price and we evolve to thinking about value for money, one of the things that we need to be thinking about is how we're going to value our sustainable procurement goals. In the United States and in many countries, we've been talking about things like a carbon tax. The beauty of valuing carbon is you can do cost trade-offs. This solution generates less carbon. That's a good deal or a bad deal. But that's only one issue. But determining whether you're going to make a sustainable decision means that you have to focus less on low purchase price, more on value for money, but you need to specifically think about value as something that is better for the air, better for the water, better for climate change, or what other goal you're trying to achieve. If you don't articulate, name, and quantify the sustainable goal and include it in your definition of value, it is impossible to achieve sustainable procurement. It just can't be done. So we need to think proactively about these types of issues. All right, now, I'm going to jump forward just for a second. This, in my lifetime, is the most pernicious problem that we face in procurement. And I say this in the United States, having spoken to our legislators many times. In explaining procurement to legislators and to children, it's important to focus on the difference between low price and value. As we often say, low purchase price can lead to a false economy. We want to be changing our nomenclature, our vocabulary, our approach, our concepts to more consumer-based approaches. In the United States, we talk about value for money, and we talk about a cost-technical trade-off. I'm willing to pay a price premium for something that lasts longer, goes faster, works better, pollutes less. But if we don't articulate the technical trade-off or the quality ratio that we're looking for, it's impossible to do so. In the European Union, they have an acronym that we love that they call MEAT, the most economically advantageous tender. When it translates to English, meat sounds like steak or beef, so it's a little bit funny. But the concept is exactly the same. Instead of focusing on low price, we need to focus on price in the context of what we're willing to pay for, and we need to include customer satisfaction. All right. One of the stories that I tell my students every year, and I normally do this in the fall, is I bring them back to when I was in college. And we're in my college dormitory room, and I'm there with my roommate, who is even smarter than I am. He's a doctor. He's an anesthesiologist at the University of Virginia Medical Center. But it was a Thursday night, and we had a mind-blowing, a devastating crisis occur in our dorm room. Our blender broke. Everybody know what blender translates? Okay. So our ability to make fancy iced drinks on a Thursday night was gone. And so it was very fortunate. I was in school in Houston, and just down the road from my university was Sears, which was one of the best manufacturers of appliances in the United States. So we went to Sears, and we walked in, and they had an entire row of blenders. And the blenders went from the least expensive to the most expensive. I was very young. At the time, I walked up. I was picking up the least expensive blender when my roommate put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Wait, we're too poor to buy cheap." Okay? And what we did is we walked to the end of the row and we bought the industrial grade blender, which cost twice as much. Now, he made a good point. When we graduated, that blender was still spinning like a top. We used it for years, it worked, it didn't break, and we didn't have to replace it. We could have bought the cheap one and maybe bought 2 more before we graduated. But at that point, the value proposition was not just buying the least expensive one, it was buying the one that would give us the greatest value over time. In our case, we wouldn't have to replace it, we wouldn't have to go without. We make these kinds of difficult decisions all the time. My children are a little older now, but I remember that era when my sons were learning to drive. And so all the parents talked about is what kind of car do you teach your children to drive in? On the one hand, you want to buy the least expensive car imaginable because they may wreck the car. On the flip side, when they do wreck the car, you want it to be safe. and the safety features are more expensive? There's no answer to this question, but we go through that internal calculus every time we make a decision. And I suggest to you we need to do more of this in procurement. Okay, now, let me add in the other part of the equation to make it very difficult. You may recall here, I said that when we think about value for money, we need to focus a little bit less on the purchase price and more on the life cycle cost. Okay. Life cycle cost is a common economic principle, and one thing that kind of makes me a little bit crazy, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, is that in procurement, we don't think about economics very much, which I find very, very strange. Procurement is business. We need more economists in procurement. All right, more on that later. When we say life cycle cost or total cost of ownership, in a classic economics classroom, we would often think about 5 elements. Instead of just focusing on purchase price, we would look at purchase price as one of 5 elements. We would also consider transaction costs. Remember I talked about transaction costs earlier? How many procurement officials spent time on this project? How much time did you spend training them? How many hours did they spend in meetings? How much money did you spend printing and distributing documents? How many people did you have on your evaluation team? How many people did you have managing that contract? All of those costs have to be added to the purchase price to actually reflect what you really spent. Next, we have operating and maintenance costs. This is actually easy if I use my automobile as an example. What are my classic operating costs for automobiles? Fuel, maybe oil, and anything that I have to replace constantly. So maybe tires. If I keep the car for a number of years, I'm going to put gasoline, fuel, and tires in there. Those are my operating costs. If I don't spend money on them, I can't use my product, but it's silly to ask, what did you pay for the car, and not consider how much it cost to actually drive the car. Similarly, what about maintenance costs? Do you need to bring the car in to have it serviced once a year, twice a year? The longer you have the automobile, the more you get serviced. The higher quality the automobile, the less often it breaks, and the less frequently you have to replace the major components. So maintenance or sustainment costs are also part of this. And now it gets to the really fun one, disposition costs. In economics, we learn that disposition costs can be a positive or a negative number. If I buy an inexpensive automobile and I drive it for 200,000 kilometers and I drive it until it breaks, I may just leave it on the side of the road and walk away. If I don't get caught, my disposition costs were zero, okay? But normally I may have some disposition costs. What, however, if I bought an expensive car, a Mercedes-Benz, or maybe a Lexus, and I drive it for 100,000 kilometers or 200,000 kilometers, and then I sell it for 50% of what I originally paid for it. The disposition cost is now a positive number that reduces my overall life cycle cost. Now, let's think about this. The analogy to life cycle cost is total cost of ownership. How much money did I need to spend for 5 years of vehicular transportation? That's what I'm trying to figure out. And the key thing to remember in procurement is there are many ways I could get there. I could buy 2 inexpensive cars and drive them into the ground. I could buy one very expensive car and maybe get some money back at the end. I could get a very light car and possibly reduce my operating costs because I'd be spending less money in fuel. I may get a nicer car, in which case I'm more comfortable, but I might have to spend more money on fuel. And all of these things are part of our life cycle cost analogy. Let me make it even more complicated. One of my favorite examples in the United States. The United States, we tend to buy one new nuclear submarine every year, okay? If you've never seen one, a nuclear submarine is a very exciting gadget. Best technology in the world, and we haven't really had a nuclear submarine accident since the 1950s. So the quality control is unbelievable. A new nuclear submarine costs more than $1 billion. That's a lot of zeros. So more than $1 billion. But that's nothing. We normally spend over a year planning the procurement, and then it takes another 2 years to build it, and then you have to manage it. So the transaction costs are very, very high, particularly because components are made in different places. Operating costs. For my Navy, the operating costs of that nuclear submarine are the cost of putting all of the sailors in it and feeding them over the course of time. We tend to use our nuclear submarines for 30 or 40 years. That's a lot of people and a lot of food that's going to go into that submarine over time. In addition, once a year, I bring it into the dock, I clean the outside, I check the engine, I spend a lot of work on it. But now we get to the end. Disposition costs. You may be interested to know it costs more to take apart a nuclear submarine than it costs to build it. So if you bring me a 30 or 40-year-old submarine that is highly contaminated with nuclear energy, it often costs more than $2 billion to take it apart, or as we say, decommission it. So how much does it cost? What is my total cost of ownership? What did I pay for it? How much money did I spend buying it? How much money did I spend using it? How much money did I spend maintaining it? How much additional money did I spend taking it apart? And then I divide that by the total number of years, maybe 30 years that I used it. And what I understand is I can come up with a number that basically says, this is what it costs to have a nuclear submarine in the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean over time. If I have that number, I may say to myself, there may be a better solution instead of doing the same thing. I may come up with an alternative to doing so. I may decide that it's better to have more or less expensive submarines because this is an inefficient solution. We can do the same thing with aircraft or automobiles or almost any other solution. But the key point that I want to make is my government and your government doesn't have this data. Now I'm going to make it even more interesting. I was at a really fun conference just a couple months ago about AI, artificial intelligence. Who's excited about artificial intelligence? Okay? If you don't read science fiction, you should. Another term for artificial intelligence is what we call machine learning. Okay? So I'm at this conference with all these experts on artificial intelligence. I have two questions. I'm a geek. I always have questions. So my two questions. First, in 2019, how can it be that in procurement systems around the world, we don't have electronic, artificially intelligent contract writing systems? Why can't I say to my computer, write me a good contract? It seems to me that should be pretty easy. And the experts had a quick answer. It's a little disappointing. Apparently the way machines learn, they learn fastest and most efficient with objective information and visual images. What machines struggle the most with is natural language. Now, what do we know from our experience? Contract interpretation is hard. That's why we've got attorneys involved in the contract process, because words mean different things. Machines aren't very good at that. Do you have in your email system the thing where it starts to finish your sentences now? Have you seen that? You're typing along and it finishes the sentence. It's right sometimes, but sometimes it says some really stupid stuff, right? That's the problem with contract writing. Okay, the other thing I asked them about is life cycle cost. This is straight mathematical analysis. Economists love this stuff. Why don't we have good life cycle cost analysis rubrics in artificial intelligence? And the answer again was disappointing. Machines learn with available data. The reason we don't have the ability to learn is nobody's been collecting the data. The private sector focuses on life cycle cost. Our governments don't. So in other words, we don't have good life cycle cost data on our infrastructure projects, our investments, our services, our goods, or the like. The automakers know exactly how much money they're getting out of each innovation they put into a new automobile. They know what price premium to charge. But we don't have good information as to whether we should spend more money on the bridge when we build it or whether we should expect to fix it in 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years. Ultimately, however, our procurement systems are going to do better if we think in terms of life cycle cost rather than purchase price. If we think about the ultimate outcome rather than the short-term process outcome of contract award. All right, now, let me add the other element into the mix. If we want to include sustainable procurement in this, we need to, in effect, as the economists would say, insert externalities into our equation. What's the externality? It's the second order effect. It's not something obvious in this analysis, but we could do the same kind of analysis and say, if I'm going to have the automobile for 5 years, I want to know what my options are in terms of injecting carbon into the air or reducing carbon. And that way I can value the price premium I'm going to pay to avoid the harm I'm going to cause. I may find out that it's more efficient for me to invest in carbon reduction technologies instead of spending the money on buying more fuel-efficient automobiles. But I can only make that decision if I have the data, and I can only have the data in the future if I care enough about the data to think about it proactively. Now, let me go all the way back to put this in context. If I put my procurement out, if I advertise my procurement, and I tell you that I'm going to award the contract to the lowest price offeror, the private sector understands that. Conversely, if I say to the private sector, I'm going to award the contract to the firm that gives me the most economically advantageous tender, or the one that gives me the greatest amount of value for money, the first thing the private sector is going to ask me is, what do you consider most economically advantageous? How do you assess value for money? And then I need to think about this. If I write my procurements, if I don't articulate my specifications, if I don't articulate my evaluation criteria in the context of saying, I do want a low purchase price, but I'm also willing to pay more for a purchase price if it saves me operating costs. I'm willing to pay more for purchase price if it reduces my maintenance costs. I'm willing to pay more if it, in effect, gives me a cleaner environment in the future. If I tell the private sector that, then they can structure their offers or their tenders accordingly. But if I don't give them that information, they can't meet my needs because I didn't articulate them. More importantly, the number of behavioral changes required to get to this point, frankly, is enormous. This is fundamentally changing the way that we think about structuring our procurements. Okay, that was a lot of issues. I understand I have 10 minutes left. Somebody out there has to have a question about something. And if you haven't figured it out by now, I have opinions on everything. So I'll take questions on just about anything.